Throughout mankind's history, the development of new and improved technologies has been one of the driving factors that has contributed to the overall progression towards where we are today. Some technological advancements, however, serve a more grim purpose than, let's say, the latest or greatest iPod or BlackBerry. I'm talking about weapons, of course. Cavemen swung clubs against one another, armies of the ancient world used pointy sticks against other armies wielding pointy sticks, etc., etc. The medieval time period, which spanned from the year 500 to 1400 AD, managed to breathe new life into what was becoming a rather stale formula of warfare. This was done through the implementation of siege warfare. Castles were springing up everywhere across Europe, and opposing forces required a new means of infiltration through the use of force. Devastating weapons such as the trebuchet, ballista, siege tower, and battering ram would be among some of the key weapons to be used in siege warfare. Before we discuss siege weaponry, however, let's talk about infantrymen and the different kinds of armament they had used. Alright, so when you think of today's modern-day soldier, you instantaneously picture him or her wielding a rifle, right? Well, throughout most of the Middle Ages, soldiers didn't have that good fortune. Instead, they were armed with weapons such as longswords, axes, spears, halberds, longbows, and shortbows, and if it's considered to be old by today's standards, then you name it. Different regions held different specializations in weaponry. For example, the English longbow, which is also referred to, the Welsh longbow, was used by the English, the Scots, and the Welsh. The English longbow proved to be very effective during the 100 Years' War between England and France in 1337 to 1453, as it was capable of striking a target from over 170 meters. Modern longbows possess a range of around 180 meters, which goes to show how valuable these ranged weapons truly were at this time in history. France, or more appropriately titled at this time, the Franks, implemented a weapon known as the Francisca, a small throwing axe that would be thrown in hopes of breaking an enemy's shield before engaging in hand-to-hand combat. The weight of the Francisca's head would create a forward momentum upon being thrown, which meant that it would reach a reasonable distance before hitting the ground, so around 12 meters. Though it was no bow and arrow, the Francisca served its purpose in medium to close range combat. The Francisca also had a tendency to bounce upon hitting hard surface at times, so try to imagine a bounce pass in basketball, the only exception being that the basketball is an axe. So next up's the claymore, which was one of the most intimidating weapons on any medieval battlefield. Said to have been used by the Celtic war hero, William Wallace, the claymore was a longsword that required two hands to use due to its great length and weight. The standard claymore offered soldiers a significant advantage in being able to reach their enemy at a further distance, opposed to shorter weapons such as standard longswords, axes, and maces. The claymore's 60-inch blade was more than enough to reach an opponent in close quarters, and if an opponent was able to get within distance of the wielder, then the claymore could have functioned as a longsword. Other unique weapons throughout medieval Europe consisted of broadswords, battle axes, the morning-star mace, and halberds. Broadswords possessed two cutting edges which were used for slashing rather than stabbing. The broadsword was predominantly used by medieval knights, and on horseback, equipped with a broadsword, it is said that the fighting capabilities of a knight were worth 10 times more than that of the common foot soldier. Battle axes were pretty much the hallmark of Viking warriors. Rather than being used to chop wood, these axes were unfortunately designed for cutting legs and arms. Axes cost much less to manufacture than swords, making them more readily available for use. Some battle axes came equipped with a double head, which made them even more lethal in combat. Battle axes were able to deliver crushing blows to armor, also making them an invaluable tool whilst fighting a heavily armored opponent. The Morning Star is most commonly accepted as a mace with a large spiked ball in the very tip. Much like the battle axe, the Morning Star was able to generate tremendous force upon being swung, making it effective against heavily armored foes. Next we have the halberd, which was essentially a spear fitted with an axe head. Halberds often came with a thorn-like hook attached to the back of the head, granting cavalry the ability to grapple the opposition while on horseback. The halberd could be used in either close or mid-range combat, depending on the size of the halberd's pull. Okay, so next up we have siege weaponry. And siege weaponry was used for destroying heavily fortified enemy positions, such as castles and forts. Siege weaponry could have also caused a shock and awe effect among enemy troops, so sort of like artillery in World War I. Siege weaponry didn't come cheaply, however, which is why tacticians had to take into account a variety of different factors, such as enemy castle fortifications and the correct positioning of siege engines on the battlefield. The trebuchet, or catapult, is probably one of the most iconic siege weapons of the medieval era. The trebuchet functioned through the use of a weight and lever system. As a weight would be dropped from the short arm of a large lever on the trebuchet, The large lever would be raised, slinging ammunition such as massive rocks, arrows, corpses, and even in some odd cases, animal manure. The results were often devastating on the opposition's fortification and soldier morale. It's almost as though you can say that modern-day artillery is derived from the trebuchet and catapult. The ballista, a giant crossbow mounted on top of a stand, was able to launch spears, large arrow bolts, and other projectiles through the use of tension. Ammo launched from the ballista was able to effectively strike multiple enemies at once, as well as wearing down the opposition's fortification. The ballista possessed inferior launching capabilities than the trebuchet, however, due to the ballista's lighter projectiles not being able to generate as much momentum as the trebuchet's heavier projectiles. So now we have siege towers, and siege towers were implemented as a means of both offensive and defensive maneuvering across the battlefield. So try to think of today's Armored Personnel Carrier, or APC for short. It's able to transport troops across the battlefield in order so that they may take up a new offensive position. The same can be said for the medieval siege tower. Rather than a vehicle, however, the siege tower was a defensive structure that was built vertically, equal to the height of the target's walls. The siege tower would be wheeled to the walls of an enemy castle, in which a drawbridge would then be lowered, allowing for troops to be garrisoned within the siege tower and commence an attack inside of the enemy's walls. One of the major flaws with the siege tower, however, was its vulnerability to fire, seeing as how it was made out of wood. So the battering ram was used in order to wear down castle gates, doors, and walls. Giant tree trunks fitted with a metal head were often used instead for battering rams, as troops would swing the ram back and forth, repeatedly striking their target until it was destroyed. Up to 100 soldiers at a single time could have been involved in swinging a battering ram, a testament to just how much force this weapon was able to pack. Leaving yourself open to an enemy attack while using the battering ram, however, was one of its major flaws. This would later be solved with the implementation of defensive plating around the battering ram. Today, special forces and police units, such as SWAT teams, still use battering rams as a means of breaking into defensive positions, such as your neighbor's house. Lastly, during the early 14th century, gunpowder was implemented through the use of heavy cannons and hand cannons. Cannons were used to inflict more of a psychological effect upon enemies, rather than actual harm, while hand cannons were used for anti-personnel purposes. Gunpowder was used very minimally at this point in time. However, we all know what's to come of that.